A field in Normandy, in the black hours after midnight on the 6th of June, 1944. A German soldier runs through the dark toward where he has just seen paratroopers fall from the sky, dozens of them, drifting down under their chutes, and the sharp crackle of gunfire spreading across the fields. The invasion. It must be the invasion. He reaches the first fallen enemy, lying still in the grass, and he rolls the body over to take the man prisoner. And he stops, because the thing in his hands is not a man. It has no face, only painted burlap, no flesh, only sand and straw. He is holding a doll, and by the time he understands what that means, somewhere behind him, a German general is already ordering tanks to move, to chase an army that was never there. The story of D-Day is usually told as a story of force, of steel and courage thrown against a wall, but Overlord was also built on something else, something quieter and stranger. It was built on a lie. The Allies could not hide the fact that an invasion was coming, so instead they spent years and fortunes on an enormous web of deception designed to hide one single thing: the where. Convince the German command that the blow would fall at Calais or nowhere yet, and the real landings in Normandy might survive their first terrible hours. On the night of the invasion itself, as the true airborne armies prepared to jump, the deceivers launched one last trick. It was small, it was almost comic, and it was deadly serious. It was called Operation Titanic. Meet the secret weapon. The British called him Rupert. He was a paratrooper made of burlap and sandbags stuffed with straw, and he stood barely 3 feet tall. In daylight, he was a child's toy. But at night, falling from a plane under a small parachute, with no horizon and no background to judge his size against, Rupert looked exactly like a full-grown soldier dropping into the dark. And he was rigged to be more than a shape. Inside him were noisemakers that crackled like rifle fire as he fell. He carried strips of foil to confuse German radar, and buried in his straw was a small charge with a timer, so that moments after he hit the ground he would explode and burn, leaving behind only an empty parachute. To the Germans who found it, it would look as if a real paratrooper had landed, cut himself free, and burned his chute before slipping away into the night. But the dummies could not act alone. To sell the illusion, real men had to go with them. The job fell to the Special Air Service, the SAS, the most highly trained soldiers Britain had. Their commanding officer thought the whole idea was madness. He had spent the war forging elite raiders, and now he was being asked to parachute a dozen of them into occupied France, not to fight a battle but to crouch in the bushes and play sound effects. Recordings, gramophone records of shouting men and rattling gunfire, switched on in the dark to make a handful of soldiers sound like an army. He called it a waste, and still his men volunteered. The plan was carved into 4 parts, Titanic 1 through 4. Around 500 dummies, carried by 4 squadrons of bombers, would be scattered far from the real drop zones, in 4 different corners of Normandy and beyond. North of the Seine, a phantom airborne division would appear from nowhere. West of Caen, another. Near Saint-Lô, another still. Each cloud of dummies was meant to pull German eyes, and German reserves, away from the beaches where the true blow would fall at dawn. One part was canceled at the last moment. There were simply too many real aircraft crowding the sky that night. But the rest went ahead. And with 2 of those drops, the SAS would go in alongside the straw. Here is a detail that almost no one knows. At 20 minutes past midnight on the 6th of June, a stick of SAS men jumped into the fields near Saint-Lô, led by 2 young lieutenants, one nicknamed Chick, the other nicknamed Puddle. They came down 10 minutes ahead of schedule. And in coming down when they did, they may have been, by a margin of minutes, the very first Allied soldiers to land on D-Day. Before the gliders that would seize Pegasus Bridge, before the great paratroop divisions. The first boots on the ground for the largest invasion in history belonged not to a spearhead of shock troops, but to 6 men whose mission was to fool the enemy with noise. And then the show began. All across the chosen fields, the dummies came down, hundreds of them, blossoming out of the bombers, thudding into the hedgerows. The noisemakers crackled, the little charges flashed and banged, and the burlap soldiers burned themselves away, leaving the eerie sight of empty parachutes hanging in the trees. And in the middle of it, the SAS men set to work. They cranked their gramophones, and the recorded roar of a battle rolled out across the countryside. Shouted orders, rifle fire, the crump of mortars, 30 solid minutes of a fight that did not exist. They opened fire on the Germans who came to investigate, and then, this was the clever, cold heart of it, they deliberately let some of those Germans get away, because a dead enemy tells no tales. A frightened, fleeing enemy runs straight back to headquarters and reports that paratroopers are landing everywhere. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Hit subscribe and like. We unbury history every week. Now, back to our story. It worked exactly as the planners had dreamed. Across Normandy in the small hours of the 6th of June, the German chain of command lit up with alarm. Reports flooded in. Paratroopers here, paratroopers there. Landings in a dozen places at once. Some of it was real. Genuine Allied paratroopers had themselves been scattered far and wide by the chaos of the night. But much of it was Rupert, the straw man. And in a war room trying to read the shape of an invasion in the dark, there was no way to tell the difference between a phantom division of dummies and the real thing, until it was too late to matter. And then came the moment that makes this whole strange story worth telling. One of the most senior German commanders in the West, reacting to reports of a parachute landing, ordered an entire armored division into motion to crush it. Not just any division, a powerful SS Panzer division, hundreds of tanks and thousands of men. They rolled out into the night, weapons ready, to destroy an enemy airborne force. And what they found, when they arrived, was a scattering of burlap dolls and burned parachutes, a Panzer division sent to do battle with sandbags. For precious hours in the most important night of the war, German strength was looking in the wrong direction, chasing an army made of straw. But we must not let the absurdity hide the cost. This was a comedy with a body count. Over Normandy that night, 2 of the bombers carrying the Dummies were shot down, 2 aircraft, 2 full crews of young men, gone. They had flown into enemy flak and died, not to drop a battalion of paratroopers, but to drop a cargo of straw soldiers. And on the ground, the SAS men were running out of luck. Near St. Lo, the deception turned real. Men were wounded. The trick of playing sounds and slipping away in the dark could only last so long before the enemy closed in for keeps. 2 of the SAS men, both wounded, were helped to a small farmhouse by their comrades, and there their war ended. The house was surrounded by some 40 heavily armed German paratroopers. There was no fight left to make, and no way out. They surrendered. Now, by the cruel logic of that war, this should have been a death sentence. Hitler had issued a standing order that captured commandos were to be executed on sight, and many of their SAS brothers met exactly that fate. But these men were spared, perhaps because they were taken near the front lines in the heat of the invasion. Perhaps because one of the officers spoke German and convinced his captors they were ordinary soldiers, not special forces. Perhaps simply because the men who caught them were fellow paratroopers who saw something of themselves in the prisoners. They were taken to a hospital, treated, and 3 months later, they were liberated. They lived. So did the Army of Dummies change the course of D-Day? The honest answer is that no single trick did. Titanic was one thread in an enormous tapestry of deception: the false radio traffic, the naval feints toward Calais, the inflatable tanks in England, the whole grand illusion. But on that night, in those hours, the straw men did their work. They thickened the fog. They added false landings to real ones, until the German command could not see the true shape of the blow. They helped buy time, and on the 6th of June, time was everything. Time was the difference between a foothold and a catastrophe. Almost none of the straw soldiers survived. Most burned themselves to ash on landing exactly as designed, leaving nothing behind. A mere handful escaped destruction, and a few of those sit today in museums in England and France. Small, faded, strangely moving figures of burlap and stuffing. One of them, the story goes, turned up decades after the war in the garden shed of a woman's late grandfather. A relic of the most peculiar mission of D-Day, gathering dust beside the lawnmower. A little burlap man who had once, for a single night, helped fool an empire. We remember D-Day for the men who ran up the beaches into the guns. We should, but we should also remember this, that the invasion was won not only by force, but by imagination. By a war room full of liars who understood that an enemy looking the wrong way is half beaten already. And we should remember the price even the lie demanded. 2 bomber crews who died in the dark dropping dolls, 6 commandos who jumped first into the most important night of the century, to crouch in a hedgerow and play a record of a battle that was not real, so that the real battle a few miles away might have its chance. An army of straw, and the flesh and blood men who paid in full to carry it.